of all of his people under all of the land from the entity that was governing them. It's about time we Palestinians start to do the same thing.
And now back live to this all-day conference with the American Arab Discrimination Committee. The next panel is up in just a few minutes here with a session on media training and how to respond to hate crimes.
I know we're running a few minutes late, and I apologize about that. Our next session is an important session. It's a very strategic session, one that will give you a lot of valuable information that you can take back with you and use on the ground and use at home. And particularly for those that are active on our issues, we hope you take away a lot from this session. It's hosted, it'll be presented by Ms. Zainab Chaudary from ReThink Media, which is a partner organization that we work with. She'll explain a little bit more of what ReThink does and get into their current program and a lot of information. So Zainab, if you want to come up and present. Thank you.
Thank you, Abed, and good afternoon, everyone. How's it going? Good? Are you all still awake, still with me? Hopefully none of this information will put you to sleep. And I try to make it as sort of informative and interactive as possible. So a little bit about ReThink Media. I am the Senior Media Associate in the Security and Rights Collaborative at ReThink Media. We bill ourselves as part PR firm, part advocacy organization. So instead of having set corporate clients, the issue areas are our clients. And we have 3 collaboratives at ReThink. Peace and Security, which deals with nuclear security issues, Money and Politics, which works on money and politics and now voting rights, and the Security and Rights Collaborative, which mainly now works on issues regarding racial profiling and discrimination against the Muslim, Arab, and South Asian community. So part of our work is really increasing the communications capacity of the various organizations and coalitions that work on this issue area, and that includes working with the Muslim, Arab, and South Asian community. I'm going to abbreviate that to the MASA community, so when I say that from now on, you know what I'm talking about. As well as working with allied groups and organizations that are lending their voice to the fight against Islamophobia. We also work in the art space in promoting Muslim artists, both domestically and abroad, in sort of amplifying their work and presenting a more proactive, positive message. So we do everything from media trainings to building relationships with reporters, to drafting op-eds, to crisis response and talking points. We do polling and analysis, message testing research, and we also have a digital director who works on some of our digital campaigns. So that's a little bit about ReThink. There we go. The first thing, I'm going to talk a little bit about message testing that we did on this issue set over the past year. But I wanted to contextualize that a little bit for folks by talking about sort of social psychology and the principles to keep in mind when you are trying to convey an idea to an audience. I'm a total social psychology nerd, so I'm going to be talking about a bunch of books. You can find me afterwards if you don't catch the names. But I read about this kind of vociferously and listen to all the podcasts about this topic, and I might reference some of them throughout my presentation. So the first theory I'm going to talk about is cognition theory. Being an effective communicator means knowing kind of where your audience is coming from. And that includes sometimes working backwards and identifying your audience first and foremost, right? Am I talking to my base? Am I talking to the choir? Do I want to sort of move persuadables? Do I want to speak to the opposition? Do I want to move the opposition? So with cognition theory, this is really, the audience is always going to draw from their experience, not yours. Right? So often when you start from a place where you're talking to someone and trying to convey something to them that completely goes counter to a belief set that they hold very strongly, they automatically reject that. And so really what's important is trying to find the shared common ground. And I heard a little bit of this at the last panel. It's finding that shared common ground with your audience. And sometimes it's not always thinking about what you want to convey, but thinking about who you're trying to reach and then working backwards to figure out what the most effective way to reach that audience is. And obviously, this is a place where you start the conversation. So we are very much fans of the inverted pyramid style of communications, where you start as broadly as possible to bring your audience in, and then you take them on a journey to bring them to the facts that you want them to understand, right? Cognition theory kind of goes to, there's this great book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. And he talks about the systems in the brain, system 1 and system 2. System 1 is very fast, intuitive, emotional. It is very visual. It relies on the senses to sort of make a judgment immediately. System 2 is more deliberative, more rational. It works a little slower. And human beings like to think that when they make a decision based on system 2. When in actuality, I hear a lot of snickers in the crowd, when in actuality, you make your decision using system 1 immediately, and then use system 2 to rationalize that decision, right? And so that's why it's important to sort of meet your audience where they are. Because they draw from their experiences, you need to start the conversation by finding the greatest common denominator. Fluency theory is the second one. This is one of my favorites. So the amygdala. I am not a medical doctor, much to my parents' chagrin. But it's a walnut-sized piece of the brain where both fear and pleasure is processed, right? And often that is also very visual in nature. But the key here is fluency theory states that if you're able to convey something to someone and they understand it quickly, they will not only retain that information, they will also repeat it. Because what that does is when you come to quick understanding of a concept or a topic, it releases dopamine in the brain. So it triggers the pleasure response in the amygdala instead of the fear response. And that when it releases dopamine, that's something that the brain wants to feel more and more, right? It's those likes on Facebook. Everyone gets really addicted to them. It's because every time you see one of those little thumbs ups, it releases dopamine in the brain and it makes you want to repeat that experience. So really what that comes down to is trying to convey something to your audience in a way that they can understand it, either within the first 30 seconds of a broadcast appearance or within the first paragraph of an op-ed, if you're thinking about this from a communications perspective, right? Because, and in contrast, if you convey to someone that something is too hard for them to understand or too difficult for them to get, it actually has the opposite effect, and people will actually reject that information and fail to understand it if that's how the information is conveyed to them. Third is social norms theory. So a group of researchers did this experiment. Everyone's familiar, this is a hotel. Everyone's familiar with those signs in hotel bathrooms that say, please reuse your towels, it helps save the environment. Everyone know what I'm talking about? Yeah. So researchers took those signs out of 50% of the bathrooms in a hotel, and they replaced them with signs that said, 70% of our guests reuse their towels to help save the environment. And they found that the second signs, the ones that stated 70% of people who stay there reuse their towels, people were more likely to reuse their towels than not, right? And that goes to social norms theory, which is why we were broadening the bench of allies we work with. And the concept of social norms theory is if the majority is doing it, you want to follow the majority. It's not the cool kids, which is why sometimes celebrity engagement fails or isn't as effective, right? Because the cool kids is a very small group of people. It's the majority of people. So how to utilize that concept, if you're thinking about an op-ed and you know that recent polling has shown that a majority of Americans oppose the Muslim ban, for instance, you can start your op-ed by saying, a majority of Americans oppose this idea, and you should too, right? So that's social norms theory. That's sort of how it comes into play. And really, at the end of the day, we try to say this because we work across a broad group of audiences. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. So what I'm going to try to present are the frames and the themes from our message testing research so that you can take them and adapt them and sort of apply them to your work depending on which audience you're speaking to. So context for our research. I know a lot of us, especially ReThink Media, was scrambling to respond to some of the news events from last year. I started at ReThink in January of 2015, and within, I think, 2 weeks was when the Chapel Hill shooting happened, where 3 Muslim college students were shot assassination style. And a lot of us have been scrambling to respond and react to the various awful news stories of the day. At ReThink, we work on a couple of different crisis response scenarios. One is a hate crime against a member of the Masa community. One is an act of violence committed by someone from the Masa community. And one is what we call a crisis of opportunity. So an example of that is when Khizr and Ghazala Khan spoke at the DNC last year, then candidate Trump insinuated that Ghazala Khan did not speak because perhaps her religion didn't allow her to. So we used that moment to launch a hashtag campaign that went viral and did really well. But really, that's like a crisis of opportunity where there is no human life at stake, but it is an opportunity for you to talk about your issues. But we wanted to know what actually is effective, what is actually getting through to our audiences and to the people that we want to reach. There we go. So ReThink Media has been dedicated to combating the rise of Islamophobia for the past 8 years. And to that end, we track the top outlets across the country for any mention of the word Islam or Muslim. And we can actually code what is Islamophobic speech. So this is a graph of the Islamophobic quotes from the past couple of years since we started really tracking the news outlets. And as you can see, there's a couple of spikes in there. There's a spike in 2011 during the Peter King hearings, in April of 2013 around the Boston Marathon bombing, in November of 2015 around Paris and San Bernardino. But that spike went really huge with the Muslim ban and rhetoric after Election Day. And so it's trying to capture moments of Islamophobic speech in order to sort of have data and be able to figure out sort of what works and what doesn't in combating that kind of speech. So our research goals were to identify our audiences, identify who is in our base universe, who is actually in our persuadable universe, and who's in our opposition. We wanted to identify successful messages and messengers because it's very important, right? Which messenger is the most effective for which audience? What messages are the most effective? We wanted to broaden our outreach to new allies so that, it's not just the MASA community, but also, we work with the interfaith community, we work with the veterans community, the business community, elected officials, conservatives, Republicans. We try to bring in sort of those those allies and make sure that their messaging is not directly harmful to the communities that are impacted. We wanted to strengthen MASA community voices. So, one of the key frustrations within the Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities, you see the same few faces on TV all the time. So we wanted to broaden that out. We actually just launched this week our resource for journalists. It's called 8.5million.org, and that's the number of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian folks who reside in the United States. But really, we've identified a couple of speakers that we can pitch to media, pitch to journalists to make sure that they are diversifying who they're speaking to. We always say the community is not a monolith, and we hope that with this group of spokespeople, we can demonstrate that more in the media space. And we wanted to know how to respond to a crisis, whether it's political rhetoric or a crisis like an attack, or when we're trying to be aspirational or proactive. So first and foremost, the bad news. These are the challenges that we found in our research. In attitudes towards Muslims in America. The first is that the fear is real. And that is because Islamophobic messaging has really permeated the public consciousness, right? So the fear that people have, what some of the quotes we had from our focus groups were, I know it's not all Muslims, but it just takes one. And what was another one? If we need to monitor mosques, synagogues, or churches in order to keep us safe, I'm okay with that, right? So the fear is real. It is very entrenched. And going back to the social psychology, if you directly in the first sentence try to counter something that someone very validly feels, they're going to tune you out immediately, right? So the concept that, I think sometimes the talking point is, furniture kills more people than terrorists do, right? That goes counter to the fear that people have. And so that might not be the first talking point, that might be towards the middle of your talking points, right? Once you've sort of brought a person on board with what you want to say. So first challenge, fear is real. Second challenge, it's not so much a challenge, it sort of segues into the third point. And that is discriminatory political rhetoric is actually rejected by most people. Most people do not agree with discriminatory political rhetoric, which is why on the campaign trail, I think then candidate Trump got a little more pushback about some of the comments that he made. But discriminatory policy is accepted by most, right? And there's a reason for that. And the reason is rhetoric seems like this, it's very obviously discriminatory, it's very obviously bigoted, it's very emotional, but a policy seems like a logical, rational solution to a fear that people hold, right? It seems like an obvious answer to this abstract, terrifying idea of ISIS. So, often in some of the media strategy we've been doing, for instance, around the Muslim ban, we continuously try to tie back the discriminatory political rhetoric to the discriminatory policy and remind people over and over again that these are the things that candidate Trump said that he is now turning into policy as president. The fourth problem is that most people do hold the idea that Islam is inherently misogynistic, that Islam oppresses women. And this was, this goes back, and I'll talk about this a little bit when I talk about our audiences, but spoiler alert, our base is not as basey as we would like them to be, right? So people who should be in our base, actually 25% of them hold this idea as well, that Islam is inherently misogynistic, that Islam oppresses women. So that's one of the challenges that we're up against. And the last one is people also hold the idea that Islam is inherently violent, right? This idea is a little less widely held amongst our base, but it is a little more widely held amongst our persuadable universe. So now that we've talked about the bad news, if I can get the clicker to work. These are our challenges again. The fear is real. Politically charged rhetoric is rejected by most, but discriminatory policy is accepted. The perception that Muslims do not treat women with respect is strong, and the perception that Muslims are too prone to violence is also widely held. So, now we get to what works. And again, I want people to sort of keep in mind the overarching frames and themes that we have here, because they can be adapted to different situations. So this is what we call our trifecta. These were the 3 specific messages that worked well with our audiences. But again, I want to point out, instead of fixating on the specific language, I want to point out some of the concepts that are sort of inherent here. And first and foremost, also, again, inverted pyramid style of communications. These are the places where you start a conversation. These are not the places where you end a conversation, right? So these are the ways to get through to your audiences from the outset. So pivoting to shared values, whether that's love of country, freedom of religion, the freedom to live without fear, the belief that we are stronger together, or any value that you share with your audience is going to be key as a starting place, right? American values obviously resonate, but I know from my experience working with some of the communities we work with, some people do hold the idea that we haven't always upheld our American values. We've had slavery in this country, we've had segregation, and so, it could be human values. It could be values that you share with a group of mothers, with a group of women, right? If you're speaking to a group of, I'm from New Jersey, so if you're speaking to a group of people from New Jersey, you could talk about Bruce Springsteen, right? Like it is that thing that connects you with your audience. It is that shared value, the shared principle, or the shared idea of something. And you can see that in our first message. Our country was founded on the principles of freedom of religion, a tradition and ideal that forms the foundation of our country. We do not tell people how to pray, and we do not ban people based on their religion. And I'm going to parse through some of the language a little bit later, but pay attention to the way this is worded, right? It is very assertive. It does not say we should not ban people. It says we do not ban people. And it draws a moral line in the sand and says, this is who we are and this is not who we are. The second message that worked well is no one should fear for their safety because of the color of their skin, what language they speak, or how they pray. Hate must not beget hate. Violence must not beget violence. We need more love and less fear. So this is, kind of biblical sounding, but it's also sort of asserting that, people shouldn't have to fear for their lives. Often, in one of our preliminary rounds of message testing, we found that when you talk about a hate crime, it's a little hard for people to visualize when they have never experienced a hate crime themselves, right? To a lot of people, a hate crime seems like, well, someone yelled at you on the street, when actually it is physical harm that is done. And so painting a very vivid picture of what that looks like, talking about a hate crime in an abstract versus talking about a pregnant woman in a hijab with her child in a stroller was attacked in a parking lot. That's much more visceral. That's much more, it's much more important for your audience to be able to connect in that way. And lastly, we are stronger when we come together as Americans and weaker when we let fear and lack of understanding come between us. America is rooted in our ability to come together. United we stand, divided we fall. So there's a great podcast. It's called the Reckonings Podcast, and it talks to people who have changed their minds completely on a political issue. And one of the episodes, they talked to a guy who was going to vote for Trump in the primary and instead switched to Kasich. And his entire motivation was, I miss the feeling that we used to have in this country of we are all in it together, right? And I think that's an idea that sort of permeates across the country right now, this feeling that people don't feel united anymore. And I think it's a little, it seems very sort of hippy-dippy, this message of love and togetherness and unity, but I think it speaks to something in America right now. As much as we talk about echo chambers and bubbles that people find themselves on Facebook, and how people are very polarized and they'll go to MSNBC or Fox News or their, whatever their media outlet of choice is and sort of tune everything else out. While that is true, there are outlets like Upworthy or stories that are inherently positive that reach everyone, right? So there is something to be said about a positive aspirational idea of unity and what that looks like and what America could look like that sort of brings people together. So those were the three messages that worked well. And then there was a fourth message that boosted the numbers on all of those messages together. And that gets to the fear response that people have. And that add-on is, we should address terrorist acts based on evidence, not single out an entire group of people based on their faith. Not only is that the right thing to do, it is more effective at keeping us safe. Right, so talking more about evidence-based investigation, there were a lot of articles following Charlottesville that equated white supremacy with ISIS. And I'll talk a little bit about why I think that's not as effective. It gets to, words resonating with people in a very different way than you think they will, and how the human brain is more likely to make the ISIS to violence connection than it is to make the white supremacy to violence connection, right? But when we talk about the epidemic of mass violence in this country writ large, there are some underlying patterns that we see, right? Often there's a domestic violence thread. Perpetrators of acts of mass violence are either themselves perpetrators of domestic violence or have been victims of domestic violence. There could be a mental health piece. When you start connecting the dots between patterns of violence, and you can actually look at things in an evidence-based manner instead of sort of saying, well, all Muslims are terrorists and all white supremacists, if you're able to connect those dots and find those patterns and find evidence-based solutions, that is actually a far more rational solution than the Muslim ban is, right? So some of the principles, and I talked about this a little bit earlier, but embedded in our language is a strong seizing of the moral high ground, right? So as I mentioned, we don't say we should not tell people how to pray. We say we do not tell people how to pray. And we do not ban people based on their religion. We are drawing a line in the sand, and we're framing a choice for people with our messaging. That's super important. You're not leading a person to a choice or telling them what to choose. You're framing it for them, and you're laying out the pros and the cons, and you're saying, when you're on this side of the line, when we're united as Americans and we don't discriminate against each other, we are stronger. And when you're on this side of the line and you allow fear to divide us, we are weaker. Which side would you choose, right? So it is drawing a line in the sand. It's messaging like no one should fear for their safety because of the color of their skin, what language they speak, or how they pray. We are weaker as a country when we let fear and lack of understanding come between us. We do not single out an entire group of people based on their faith, right? So it is drawing that strong moral line in the sand and framing a choice for people so that they make the right choice. So there are 3 steps that are critical to increasing affinity for Islam and Muslims in America. One is to diminish the distance by calling upon agreed upon beliefs. So the goal is to create a bridge of understanding, common ground, and start with widely held views. The second is invoking shared aspirational values, using these to call for better treatment and to paint a picture of what we want our world to be. If we look at our trifecta of messaging, basically what it does is it reminds people what their values are, right? It says to people, these are the values that you purport to hold. And then it reminds them to apply those same values to a group of people they would not otherwise apply them to, right? So it is that reminder. We're not asking them to apply those values to a group of people in a vacuum. We're reminding them first. We're saying, you say you believe this, and if you do, you should apply it to this group of people. And third, we want to reassure the fearful by creating distance from radicals and terrorists with strong pushback messaging in a combination with our positive aspirational messages. Some of the other concepts I'm going to talk about. When I say, don't think of the elephant in the room, what is the first thing you think of? The elephant, right? When we have messaging that repeats a claim made by the opposition, what we're doing is we're not counteracting that claim. We're basically reinforcing that message with our audience, right? So when I say something like refugees are fleeing their countries because they're fleeing the violence from ISIS in their particular countries, what people hear is not that they are seeking refuge here. People hear refugees, violence, ISIS, and they don't want them here. They don't want them to bring that here. And often when we talk about the work, I am totally guilty of this. I say, we're working to counter Islamophobia, or we're working to fight anti-Muslim bigotry. We talk about what we're fighting against, but we don't talk about what we're fighting for, right? And that is super, super important because it resonates with people on a completely different level. When you say, we are fighting for the freedom of all Americans to be able to practice their faith without fear or intimidation. It's totally different, right? What we don't want to do is repeat a misconception that is being sort of widely spread by the opposition, right? We are doing their work for them. They get enough airtime as it is. We want to set a positive aspirational frame. We want to step away from that messaging. We want to talk about this on our own terms. One of the things I often say is, we in our messaging sometimes play in the opposition sandbox instead of creating our own sandbox. So they make a claim, Muslims are violent, Muslims are inherently misogynistic, and we say, no, they're not, and here's the proof why. And no one, we're responding to them always. Instead of saying, here are our stories, here is what this community actually looks like, right? And so also, the positive aspirational frame is it just resonates more with people. And it's a little hard. One of the key questions we got in January was, how can you be positive and aspirational when it feels like there's so much happening that's terrible for these communities? Or when hate crimes have spiked 67% in 2015 alone against these communities. And it's, tweaking the messaging, right? So it's talking about those hate crimes. It's talking about the very tangible ways in which those hate crimes impact people. But then ending, if you're writing an op-ed, I always think in op-ed mode. But if you're writing an op-ed, it's ending with, and here are 5 things you can do to stand with your Muslim neighbors, right? It gives people something to aspire to. It gives them a concrete action to take. And it ends on an aspirational note. I know we all know this, but I'm going to reiterate it. Words mean things, right? So the words that you choose to use will either resonate or not resonate with your audience, and it goes back to psychology. The best example I can give of this is in the initial stages of our research, we found that certain words do not resonate with people. And those words, ironically, are diversity, inclusivity, tolerance, and understanding. Why? Because the right associates those words so strongly with the left that even folks in the middle hear that, right? Words that do resonate with people are dignity, fairness, and respect. Dignity, fairness, and respect is those are the overarching principles that people can agree on, right? If you are a Muslim American in this country, you are simply looking to live your life with dignity, fairness, and respect. If you're a refugee, you're looking to come here to live your life with dignity, fairness, and respect. If you're an African American, you are simply looking for dignity, fairness, and respect. And if you're a white, rural American from an economically depressed region, you're also looking for dignity, fairness, and respect, right? Those words will resonate across the board with people. Similarly, and I don't know if folks are familiar with this, but within the Muslim, Arab, and South Asian community, there's a lot of debate about, do we say Muslim American or American Muslim? This has been going on for the last 16 years. We hear this debate kind of pop up all the time, so we decided to test this premise in our message testing. And we found that actually what wins is Americans who are Muslim, right? Why does that work better? It's because Americans is the noun, and Muslim is simply one adjective that describes a multifaceted person, right? And you could change that. You could say surfers who are Muslim or bakers who are Muslim. It's still the same concept. It's still a noun that is what this person is and an adjective that describes this person, right? It's like Mad Libs. You remember Mad Libs? Adjective here. And that's why that concept works a little better. Similarly, when we asked people, when we said, Muslim Americans are monitored closely by the United States, people sort of rejected that premise. They were like, yeah, but we're all monitored in the United States. We all take our shoes off at the airport. I'm okay with that. It keeps our country safe, right? When we modified that sentence to say Muslim Americans are monitored more closely than other Americans, that shifted the way people thought about things. It was no longer equal, right? It was different. And Muslim Americans were being treated differently with far more scrutiny than normal Americans experience. So words do matter. The way we word things does matter. So the force field of what we want to do. If the status quo is in the middle, and the opposition messages and our messages are both trying to impact the status quo, we want to strengthen our messages. Going back to politically charged rhetoric is rejected by most. A majority of Americans believe that Americans who are Muslim deserve to be treated with dignity, fairness, and respect. We go back to our top messages. We want to weaken the opposition's messages. We want to weaken the messages that Muslims are prone to violence, that they disrespect women, that we are better safe than sorry, that national security trumps civil rights. And that's sort of the way we want to think about messaging when we're doing messaging, right? I talked a little bit about the Twitter campaign that we did after Khizr Ghazal Khan spoke at the DNC, and that sort of took a lot of these elements into play. It was the Can You Hear Us Now hashtag campaign, where Muslim women were told, basically post a photo of yourself, talk about who you are, talk about what you do, and use the hashtag. And it was just such a vivid array of women who work in the UN, who work to fight for human rights, who are lawyers, who are activists, who are amazing. And that pushed back against a lot of these messages that the opposition tends to use. And you would think a lot of trolls would come out of the woodwork, but actually most of the responses we got from people who weren't from the community were, I never knew this about Muslim women. I had no idea there was so much diversity. And it was great. It was a lot of fun to be a part of that. Oop, went a little too fast. So I talked about our audiences. We always talk about the bell curve, right? So this is the bell curve. You've got your choir, you've got your base, you've got your persuadable middle, you've got your opposition, and your unreachables. And so what you really want to do with your messaging is kind of decide who you want to talk to. Maybe you just want to talk to your base, and maybe you want to strengthen, maybe you want to keep the choir engaged and keep them from burning out. Maybe you want to strengthen your base. Maybe you want to bring persuadables in. Maybe you want to try to talk to the opposition or move the opposition from opposition to persuadable, or maybe you want to push the opposition and the unreachables to the fringes so that people don't follow them, right? Because with the Can You Hear Us Now campaign, when trolls did come out of the woodwork to mock this or insert themselves into the conversation, they were kind of, dumped on by everyone else on Twitter, right? Because they made themselves look crazy. There's a great article in Slate, I think from last year, which talks about how brands use trolls to their advantage, right? So when Gap comes out with an ad that features a Sikh American, it's just a photo of a person wearing Gap clothes. There's no message there. So when trolls come out and say, how dare you include this person in your campaign, they're the ones who look crazy, and the brand is the one that looks good, right? So there's a concept here as well of sort of, a lot of folks I know are working to bring the opposition at least to the persuadable middle, but a lot of people are also working to sort of push them to the edges so that they don't have as much sway. And I know folks can't see this, it's super tiny, but there's a woman named Rachel Brown who's done some great research on diffusing hate. And she has this schematic of audiences, and it's involvement on the left-hand side and attitude on the bottom. So on the upper left, you've got people who are high involvement, negative attitude. Those are dangerous speech speakers, people who participate in group-targeted harm willingly, people who encourage others to participate in dangerous speech. So basically, you can think of that as the Charlottesville, the folks who are violent in Charlottesville, right? Below that are people with low involvement and negative attitude. These are people who won't necessarily go out to a rally or wouldn't go out to Charlottesville, but who hold the same ideas as the folks in Charlottesville, right? In the middle, top middle, we've got high involvement, neutral attitude. Those are often influential leaders, information spreaders. They're people who participate in group harm reluctantly or unknowingly. So you can think of this as elected officials, Congress sometimes. On the bottom middle, we've got low involvement, neutral attitude, reluctant audience members. You can think of this as non-voters, people who are kind of apathetic or indifferent or don't know much about the issue set. Bottom right, low involvement, positive attitude. So those are people who won't necessarily go out to a rally at an airport to fight against the Muslim ban, but also agree that the Muslim ban is terrible, right? And then the top right, those are our superstars. Those are high involvement, positive attitude. Those are the people who showed up at the airports earlier this year. Those are the people who speak out. Those are the activists. And really, that schematic of how you want to move these audiences, it looks very different for each audience, right? For the high involvement, negative attitude folks in the top left, you want to either move them to low involvement or you want to move them to neutral attitude, right? You want to move them to low involvement so that they do less harm to others, right? So they may still have a negative attitude, but at least they won't act upon it. Or you can move them to neutral attitude because at least they'll be involved but not physically violent towards people. With low involvement, negative attitude, most likely you want to prevent them from moving to high involvement, right? You want to stop them from moving to that top left box. And you want to maybe shift them over to low involvement, neutral attitude so they do less harm, right? So these are the ways we think of how to shift audiences. For high involvement, neutral attitude, you might want to shift them to high involvement, positive attitude. You want to provide them with some materials and say, hey, you're really involved, but you're going about this the wrong way. Here's some information, right? And if you think about the top right, high involvement, positive attitude, you want to keep those folks engaged and stop them from burning out, right? There is, you want to sustain that movement. You want to keep it going. You want to keep them engaged and involved. So that's sort of how I like to think about audiences and the ways in which we influence them. And with that, it's the end of my presentation. Does anyone have any questions? A YouTube thing. I don't think I mentioned anything on YouTube. We had a Twitter campaign that we did. Do you know what it was? I don't know that I referenced anything on YouTube necessarily. Although YouTube and Google and Facebook do have teams right now that are sort of working on these problems as well. But
that way some of us could get that to you in email. Your PowerPoint, is there a way we could, in the audience, get it if we wanted it?
Sure. So my email address for people who would like it, I'll go slow. It's Zainab, so it's Z like zebra, A-I, N like Nancy, A, B like boy, at ReThink Media, it's one word, ReThinkmedia.org. and I'm happy to send a PDF or at least some of the tips from the presentation.
Yes, and I would just like to say with that, we work closely with ReThink Media as part of our MASA coalition. They've produced a lot of great resources and messaging materials, including memes, that we've used in advocacy, not only on the Muslim ban and other related things, but when acts of terror occur and they're used as a way to exploit immigration and national security policies.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. It was an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
And one that I think our community really needs, because we don't look enough at the psychology of how we talk and how we try to educate others. So I think it was an amazing presentation. Thank you so much. And I'm so glad that our young people are doing this.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, it's also a personal passion. So it definitely helps that I absorb a lot of this information like a sponge. But I'm glad that it was useful.
We have one in the back.
Can you just give us the name again of that book that you spoke about at
Yes.
the beginning?
Yep. So I'm actually going to give you the names of 3 books. That's sort of all of. There's a longer training that I do that's just on social psychology and some of the tactics that you can use. So the first book is Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Kahneman. The second book is Incognito, The Secret Lives of the Brain by David Eagleman. And the third book, which I highly recommend, is The Big Sort by a journalist named Bill Bishop. And he actually talks about how America has sort of self-segregated itself on a number of different levels over the past 30 years or so. So those books are great. Like I said, I have a presentation. So what I talk about is like the theories or the various concepts of social psychology. There's a whole section about conscious thought versus unconscious thought in terms of implicit bias, right? So, like 10% of our brain function is conscious and 90% of it is under the surface. So there's this thing called the button experiment where researchers put people in front of a button and in front of a screen, and they're told in the first round, okay, if you see a positive word, hit the right button, and if you see a negative word flash on the screen, hit the left button. And the word flashes on the screen for literally like 5 seconds. So you have to very quickly hit the right button or the left button. The second round, they say, okay, if you see an image of a fat person, hit the right button. If you see an image of a skinny person, hit the left button. People did that, right? Third round, people were told, if you see a positive word or an image of an overweight person, hit the right button. And if you see a negative word and the image of a skinny person, hit the left button. And there was a lot more lag time there because people don't associate overweight people with positivity and skinny people with negativity, right? So there's an implicit bias question as well. And some of the tactics of fluency theory in terms of getting through to people is metaphor and analogy. My favorite clip to use in that presentation is a Fox News clip where they're talking about Iran's capacity to build a nuclear bomb. And there's a brilliant PhD in nuclear physics named Jim Walsh, who's on this panel. And he's talking about the facts and the science and why it's not possible for Iran to have built a nuclear weapon. And then there's this Fox News panelist who interjects, and she's like, well, listen, it's like baking a cake, right? You have the ingredients, you have the pan, you have the recipe. All you need to do is put them together and bake a cake. And even if you disagree with that woman, she got through to you much quicker than the other guy did, right? Because she used metaphor and analogy, and she was able to get to an audience's understanding immediately. Because not everyone has a PhD in nuclear physics, but everyone's baked a cake. At least most everyone's baked a cake. Any other questions?
Any last questions?
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for doing this. This is a great
Thank you.
presentation and good study. Takes a lot of time. Do you do this such presentations among people, like, for example, in mosques, big mosques, among women and men there, and also among academia, in the academy?
Sure.
level. For example, I don't see in the academic level is holding this kind of understanding of the society as a whole, and discussion there, and making the student understand
Right.
where they are.
So I will say that as much as we would love to provide these trainings as broadly as possible, it's more a capacity issue. It used to be there were only 2 of us who ran the Security and Rights Collaborative. Now there are 4 of us, but it's still sort of a little limited. What we do is we do national and regional spokesperson trainings. So it's really equipping a broad group of people in various regional areas to ensure that they're prepared for local media, because local media is super important in this moment. It's still the media that people trust the most, right? So we did one in Nashville, we did one in LA, we just did one in Chicago, we've done one in New York, we're going to do one in DC soon. We try to bring in academics and local religious leaders, but it's mostly just where we end up going at any given time. But hopefully when we do our next ones, we can reach out and get some names from people. But we are also seeking to add people to our Speakers Bureau, as I was talking about. And so it's, we try to equip people. So if someone is about to go on news media and they want to just go through a practice run with us, we're happy to do that. We provide advice as we can. It's just a capacity question more than anything else.
All right, thank you. Thank you, ReThink Media.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to take about a 10-minute break and then jump right into our last panel for today, entitled Charlottesville, the Reemergence of White Supremacy. There are still a couple of lunches back there, so feel free to take it because we already paid for it, as well as sodas, or if you just want to steal the cookies, that's okay too. See you in 10 minutes. Thank you.
What kind of cookies?
Listen up the schedule. Sometimes they say, want to take a break.
Just to move the podium out and put the chairs in.
Good. Like everybody in class, but something. Okay. Good.